could have more.
Hello and welcome to our Fleet Emission Consulting webcast, today live from Munich. I'm very glad that you all made it to this webcast in which we want to talk with you about CO2 emission in fleets, and our new service, Fleet Emission Consulting. I'm not alone in the studio. Today I have support by my guest, Johannes Weber from Plan A. Hi Johannes, welcome to have you here.
Hi Andreas, thanks for having me.
Johannes, today we want to talk about CO2 emissions, the importance of CO2 emissions within fleet and the increasing importance about CO2 emissions in the transportation sector. I have a number with me. 15% of CO2 emission in the EU are caused by the transportation sector, in which we and you are all, of course, included. So 15% is for me a pretty relevant number.
Yeah, indeed, it's actually a super relevant number, and I think that can also be seen if you look at the European Green Deal, which is like the EU Commission's overall framework to reduce greenhouse gases emissions. It actually places a super high importance on the transportation sector, which, as this slide shows here, is responsible for roughly 15% of all the CO2 emissions within the European Union. So that really indicates that lowering emissions from the transportation sector can have a sizable impact to combat climate change, and as I mentioned before, is also core to the EU strategy on combating climate.
So we can already take this with us, that basically transportation is not the highest emitter of CO2 emissions in the EU, but is one of a very relevant emitter, right?
Exactly. It's a very relevant emitter, particularly for everybody also who lives in cities. We know that despite the impact of CO2 for global warming, it also has an impact on citizens in cities. So reducing emissions from the transport sector supports not only reducing climate change, but also supports cleaner cities, which is another key point of the EU Green Deal.
So as you can see, a very relevant topic, and that's also why we've introduced our new service, the Fleet Emission Consulting. You can see the agenda for the next 60 minutes. We want to talk, we want to show you what we are offering in the Fleet Emission Consulting. Then Johannes will explain us a little bit more into carbon accounting and what it's all about. And of course, we're going to also show you a demo, a short preview of the Alphabet Carbon Manager, which is live, which is available right now. And in the last part, feel also free to ask your question, type it in the chat sector so we can get an interaction with you and answer or try to answer all your questions. So let's start with the topic Fleet Emission Consulting and why we believe it is needed. Basically, we see the numbers. We see that you as our customers are having a need in this kind of topic. Last year, we did the Fleet Emission Monitor, and within this, we asked over 700 fleet decision makers in all Europe what they think about CO2 emissions of their fleets. And 64% stated that the reduction of CO2 in their fleets is very important. 64%. On the other hand, 33% stated that they are doing their CO2 emission calculation still manual via Excel, which is, of course, time consuming, right? And also can be done mistaken, or can be done with a couple of mistakes. So every time you have a manual process, it's not 100% accurate. And the last number I wanted to give you is that by now 20% of the asked fleet decision makers stated that they are not calculating their CO2 emissions. So I think the numbers speak for themselves, that we see that there is a growing need for emission calculations within fleets. But how are emissions calculated in fleets? You can see on this page an overview of the 3 sections how emissions are divided. They are divided in scope 1, direct emissions, scope 2, indirect emissions, and scope 3, indirect emissions, upstreams and downstreams. And for us being in the fleet business, basically scope 1 and scope 2 are the most important scopes, because in this the leasing cars, the leased cars are calculated. In scope 1, all combustion engine cars, direct emissions from leased vehicles are calculated. And in scope 2, we are calculating the electricity used for fully electric cars or plug-in hybrids. And this is also the section which the Alphabet Carbon Manager is calculating the CO2 emissions. So I want to make this very clear from the beginning. The Alphabet Carbon Manager doesn't calculate the emissions from all your vehicles within your company, but only the leased vehicles which are leased with us or with another leaseco. I brought also with me an example of how CO2 reduction or better electrification can lower the CO2 emissions within a fleet. You can see here on the left side a fleet, an example fleet of 100 vehicles. We stated with an annual mileage of 30,000 kilometers, and you can see how much CO2 would been emitted by this 100% combustion engine fleet in 1 year. And then if we go further to the right, we are transforming the fleet to an electric fleet. So in the second year, we have a small share of battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids, and this is increasing till the end. So in year 6, you can see that the 100 vehicles are now 100 battery electric vehicles. And you can still see that there is CO2 that they are CO2 emitting. This is due to the reason because we are calculating with the energy mix. Here in this example, the EU energy mix. And Johannes, in the EU energy mix, there's always also a part of gray electricity. Maybe you can explain a little bit what's the difference between gray and green electricity.
Exactly. So in this example, we used the grid mix for the European Union. And what that actually means is, like, in the generation of electricity, we use different fuel sources, right? Generally speaking, there is obviously coal, different types of coal. There's natural gas for electricity production, and then there's, of course, the entire set of renewable electricity that is calculated in this average number. And the point that we wanted to make in this example is, like, if we apply the average grid mix, which means roughly a share between 30 and 40% of renewables across the EU, and then, of course, in individual countries, that might be a little bit higher or a little bit lower. But if we apply this average grid mix, we account for the fact that the electricity that is used to charge electric vehicles is not 100% based on renewable energy. Now, assuming that the implementation of renewable energy sources across the EU will actually accelerate over the next few years, we'll actually also see an increasing share of renewables in the grid mix, which then means that the gray electricity in the grid mix is lowered. And if we get to the point where ideally we have 100% renewable energy in our grid mix, then your electric fleet would actually be run on absolutely zero emissions.
Perfect, thank you. So this means basically in year 6, where we now have where we have still CO2 emitting, during the time becoming a higher share of green electricity within the EU or the different markets, this number will also decrease.
Exactly, like the numbers that we used here are the average numbers for 2022. I don't know if anybody followed the news, but yesterday actually the International Energy Agency announced that globally the share of renewable electricity has increased substantially over the last few years and will be accelerating over the next decade. So as you just pointed out, Andreas, this number, like the share of emissions in this example, let's say until 2030 will be much lower.
Much lower, yeah. I also brought with me some additional numbers, namely the compensation amount of money you would have to spend if you want to decarbonize this fleet. Decarbonization is a way which we all should go to, but we know also that we cannot make a fleet from one day to another 100% green with using fully electric vehicles. So the compensation of this by buying decarbonization certifications is a way which can be done and which a lot of you are already doing. And sometimes we don't know, okay, what is the price of this anymore? So we are calculating with 180 euros per ton of kilometers. And you can see that by transforming the fleet to a fully electric fleet, you also save money when you are buying CO2 certifications. In this example, it's 50,000 euro. You will see it later in the demo version that this number can also be much more higher. Of course, if you have a bigger fleet, always imagine these are only 100 cars. But also here we can see that the transformation can also have a cost advantage, at least if you are buying CO2 decarbonization certifications right now.
Exactly. Maybe if I can just add one point to that for the costs, because also in this example, the CO2 certificates are based on 22 pricing. Given increasing regulations on reporting CO2 emissions and actually taking climate action, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more detailed, but we will also expect that prices for CO2 certificates will go up. And I just wanted to make that point because I think if we would give this presentation in 5 years from now, that cost saving would actually be even higher.
Thank you. To make it even more feasible, I also brought an example from our own emissions. What you can see here is the emissions of Alphabet International. I think it was in 2020, and you can see that the highest emissions are coming, or the biggest share of our CO2 emissions are with our own fleet. So, I mean, we are a leasing company and we are a sales company, so we are not producing anything. So it's rather normal that the amount is this high. But I just want to be very open here with you that we know that the fleet can be a significant CO2 emitter also within your organization. And if we do the calculation, which we just did earlier, then we can see that the Alphabet fleet emitted 3,912 tons of CO2. And if we are compensating this, which we are doing, it is 700,000 euro. So it is very relevant also for us to switch to a more greener fleet to lower these emissions for, of course, sustainability effects, but also for budget effects. As you can see by now, the topic is complex and the topic is linked to each other. Decarbonization and electrification of the fleets are going hand by hand. And that is also the reason why we've introduced Alphabet Consulting. With Alphabet Consulting, we want to consult you on your decarbonization roadmap, but also on your electrification roadmap. If you have a need in setting up ECA policy, maybe with CO2-based figures, or if you want to get, if you want to know how much your fleet emitted in the past, and you want to have prognosis how the CO2 emissions will be in the future, we can support you with our new offer, Alphabet Consulting, and here especially Fleet Emission Consulting. We also offer a bunch of other consulting services to you, from charging analysis, driver profiling, of course TCO calculation, or even driver communication concepts. So wherever you see a need in a more deeper support, feel free to reach out to your contact persons in the markets or in the headquarters, and we are happy to support you on your road to a more sustainable fleet. All right, Johannes, now I think it's time to get a little bit more into more details of carbon accounting and what it's all about.
Great, thanks Andreas. And before I get into the details of what carbon accounting actually is and what are like the, broadly speaking, principles behind carbon accounting, I just want to give you a quick overview of what Plan A is actually doing and how we support companies around the globe to really lead their transformation along their net zero journey. So Plan A was actually built on the commitment to enable businesses to really lead the transformation towards a lower carbon economy. And to do so, what we provide is the Plan A Carbon Manager. And the Plan A Carbon Manager actually is a tool that helps companies, let's say, digest really complex and large data sets, helps them to understand what are the emissions of their companies, helps them to understand what is the mitigation potential of different actions. And so we really try to help companies provide a solution, a one-stop shop solution that takes out the need for actual subject matter experts in the company and have actually the tool be the subject matter expert for everything that is carbon accounting, ESG reporting, and emissions management. And as such, we really want to enable businesses to manage their net zero journey and support the global fight on climate change. So what is actually greenhouse gas accounting or carbon accounting? Essentially, carbon accounting is a set of principles, is a set of methodologies that essentially lays out the rule on how to account emissions of an organization or of a product. An important to mention here is like there are various standards for doing greenhouse accounting. There is the most widely accepted framework for that is actually the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is actually also the framework that is underpinning the tools that we provide, and also that underpins the Alphabet Carbon Manager. And what that actually does, it really helps organizations understand, for example, how do I set organizational boundaries? What type of emissions actually do I need to account? Or for example, if I have incomplete data, what methodologies can I apply to account for different data availability across the company or across different products? And so, for example, in the context of vehicle fleets, what that means is, let's imagine fleet managers have only 70% of fuel data of their cars, and for 30% they only have data on total mileage within a given year. Then the GHG protocol actually provides the methodological framework for companies, and in this case, obviously for the tool, on how to actually apply different methodologies to account for the different data that is available for companies. And I will go into a little bit more in detail of this in just a second. Now, we actually already heard a little bit about different scopes of emissions, and Andreas already pointed out what are direct emissions, what are indirect emissions. I want to pick up on that in the context also here of fleet emissions. So in a nutshell, direct emissions are essentially the emissions that occur that are under the direct control of a company. I think a good example here is if we think about burning, for example, natural gas for electricity production, but of course also the fuel use in a vehicle fleet. And so in this case, the emissions that come from both electricity production or from the cars in the fleet would be direct emissions, so there would be your Scope 1 emissions. At the same time, electricity is also an interesting example, because if we think about this in the context of charging an electric vehicle, as I just mentioned, electricity can be the utility providers that actually produces the electricity, can be his direct emissions. But for the company who uses that electricity to actually charge their vehicles, there would be indirect emissions. And yeah, as I just mentioned, like the emissions from the electricity consumption of a reporting company are a good example of these indirect emissions, and obviously make sense in the context of today's presentation. But as I mentioned, electricity can also be the direct emissions of the utility provider. Sorry, I went to the wrong direction here. So yeah, we talked already about Scope 1 emissions. We talked about Scope 2 emissions. For completeness, I also wanted to mention that there are Scope 3 emissions that are not necessarily the focus of the presentation today, because as Andreas already pointed out, most relevant are actually Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. But as I mentioned, for completeness, there are also upstream Scope 3 emissions and downstream Scope 3 emissions. Just to give you an example of what that could be, imagine you're a car manufacturer from Munich and you purchase aluminum to actually produce your cars. And there are emissions associated with the production of aluminum that are not that car manufacturer's direct emissions, because they are produced by a supplier. So this would be an upstream Scope 3 emissions. Now, at some point, a client of this car manufacturer, after maybe driving 1 million kilometers, decides to actually scrape his vehicle and decides to give this to recycling. So the emissions that are related to the energy use in the recycling process would be downstream activities and downstream Scope 3 emissions. What I also want to point out with this slide here is actually what emissions are actually accounted, because obviously we are talking always about CO2 equivalents, and what that actually means I can show here with this slide real quick. You see on the top of the slide the 7 emissions that are actually most impactful for global warming, and that also need to be accounted according to the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And I think for those of you who sometimes listen to the news, you sometimes hear these updates on where do we actually stand on our journey to 1.5 degrees or to 2 degrees, and usually the information is provided by the IPCC on where we stand on climate change. But the IPCC actually also lays out what type of emissions need to be accounted, because in the combustion of different types of fuels, there's of course not just CO2 that gets emitted, but also other GHG or greenhouse gases that you see on the top here: methane, nitrogen oxide, sulfur, certain types of fluorides. Not going to go into the details of those, but what I really want to illustrate is what CO2 equivalents actually mean. So each of these greenhouse gases has a different global warming potential. And to make carbon accounting a little bit more easy, and for companies not having to report 7 different greenhouse gases, we just use one number, which is the CO2 equivalent, which simply means it's an addition of the different global warming potential of each of those gases and expressed as one number. I know this is maybe a little bit confusing for those of you who are too much into carbon accounting, but to just give you a super simple example, imagine you have a combustion engine, a combustion process in which you have the burning of 1 gram of CO2 and 1 gram of methane. Methane has a global warming potential that is 28 times as high as CO2, and the resulting number then would be obviously 21, because you have 1 gram of CO2 and the equivalent of 28 grams of CO2 that come from methane. Anyways, I know this is a lot of information to digest, but I just wanted to make that point because when we talk about CO2 and when we later go into the demo, you will see always the number CO2 equivalent, and this equivalent actually expresses all these numbers.
That's what I wanted to ask you also. That means the CO2, we are talking also only about CO2. We are calculating CO2. But within the Alphabet Carbon Manager, we are not only basically calculating the CO2, we are calculating the CO2 equivalent, which also includes the 6 other emissions. As
exactly. So the results that are provided by the Alphabet Carbon Managers are aligned with not just the GHG protocol, but also with the recommendations by the IPCC. So even though we only provide one number, which is the CO2 equivalent, in reality, it's a CO2 equivalent that calculates all these emissions that you see here on the top of the screen. I'm always going in the wrong direction with my clicker. Apologies for that. So why does this actually matter for fleet managers? And there are a number of reasons why that matters, particularly in the context of global climate change. But I think the most important factors why all this science that goes actually into the Alphabet Carbon Manager matters is impact. Scope 1 and 2 emissions do have a substantial impact on the climate. Andreas already pointed that out earlier today. And there's an increasing pressure from the legislative side to actually report emissions, in which Scope 1 and 2 emissions are essentially the bare minimum that companies need to report. But it's also important to report accurate numbers that can be reported on an annual basis and that are reliable and provide reliable CO2 footprints. The second point that I wanted to mention is actually electrification planning. So whoever takes decisions on investing in battery electric vehicles or plug-in hybrid electric vehicles to move away from combustion engines needs to understand what are actually the investments necessary, not only in electric vehicles and infrastructure, but in addition to that, also needs to understood very clearly like what are actually the environmental impacts on moving to low emission alternatives, and have this aligned with financial and in terms of financial and environmental terms. So really, it's a way to really take business decisions. And then I already was hinting to increasing legislative environments. There's increasing public scrutiny, regulatory scrutiny on actually monitoring carbon emissions of companies. And that simply means that there's a need for a tool that is not only reliable in terms of accurate data, but that's also aligned with international standards and international frameworks for carbon accounting, which is actually exactly what the Alphabet Carbon Manager does.
So this is exactly the point where we said at the beginning, of course, you can calculate the CO2 emissions via Excel file, but if you then have to report that on an annual basis, also to your stakeholders and shareholders, then of course it should be reliable. And I think that's also something which you will show us in a bit, how this is done.
Exactly. I mean, the idea really is to enable the people who use the tool to actually not have to understand all the science that I was just explaining, right? I mean, we want to use this opportunity to really help the audience to understand the scientific approach and the reliability behind this tool. But the idea is really to enable people that don't do carbon accounting, that don't do climate science, to have a reliable tool at hand that actually avoids the risk of making mistakes by maybe using methodologies that are not aligned with international standards. Or if you mentioned the example that a lot of this is actually simply done in Excel, Excel is a great tool, but of course, like if you work a lot with Excel, then there's really the problem that there's a risk for mistakes. Now, I just want to quickly point out the increasing public scrutiny through regulatory measures. If we look at this graph here, we really see that over the last few years, between 2018 and 2024, there was really an increase in regulations that require companies to report their environmental impacts. And I want to be really brief on this one, but we will expect that in 2024, with the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, roughly 49,000 companies will have to report their environmental impact, as well as particularly their emissions. So in total, we estimate that 75% of companies in 2024 will be required to disclose their environmental impact, and the majority of those disclosures actually will be related to decarbonization measures.
One short question, Johannes, to the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which you just mentioned. I understood that this is now coming for most of the companies, which we are also in relationships within. In this Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, companies have to count their CO2 emissions, not only for the fleet, but for the whole organization. But what is now very new is that specifically also the fleet needs to be calculated. That is right?
Exactly. So as you pointed out earlier, and that's actually a great segue here into the next slide, as you pointed out earlier, fleet emissions are Scope 1 and Scope 2. And Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions are essentially the bare minimum what companies will need to report under the new CSRD. Here you just see a brief overview on the essentially on the rollout of the CSRD that will come into effect in 2024. It will essentially affect in the next year only the largest companies within the EU, as well as some large companies outside the EU that do business within the EU. But until 2026, essentially all companies, except companies that have less employees than 50, will be required to report under the CSRD, in which, as you pointed out, Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions are actually a very central part of the reporting. And again, the reporting needs to be reliable, and it needs also to be reliable for auditors, because the CSRD will be required, or will require companies to actually also audit, have audited reports. Moving forward, I just wanted to go over a super quick example on how what's actually the basic formula for carbon accounting. So if you look at this, the math looks relatively easy, despite that there's a lot of science that goes into. We essentially just take the business activity data of a company, that can be the total fuel use, and the conversion factor of that fuel. So that is specific to whether it's diesel, if it's petrol or electricity, as well as location and time specific. And then we take a multiplication that gives us the total number of emissions, again, as a CO2 equivalent, including all the GHG emissions under the IPCC. And just to give you a more applicable example, in this example, for example, we see that a battery electric vehicle was driven 48,000 kilometers per year. It's based in the UK, but that's actually all the information we have. We don't know how much electricity was used for charging this vehicle, but what we do know, what the Alphabet Carbon Manager knows, that in the first step he needs to actually estimate the fuel use or the electricity use for driving 48,000 kilometers. That's actually done by numbers that are stored within the tool. And then the math gets relatively simple, right? You multiply the 48,000 kilometers by the average electricity use on a per kilometer basis, which in this example are 0.18 kilowatt hours, times the conversion factor for the UK electricity grid, and it gives us the 2.2 tons of CO2. If we take this example here for a diesel vehicle, the math is actually much more easier, because in this example we have the total fuel that was used over the year. So here the math would be simply total fuel use times the corresponding emission factor for diesel in Germany gives us 12.1 tons of CO2 equivalent. I just have one more slide, and I wanna just point out a couple different things. So in those two examples, you saw that the data might actually vary across. Actually, within the same fleet, you might have data that relates to an electric vehicle that might relate to a diesel vehicle, and we might actually have different information on total electricity or fuel use. And the point I really want to make is that actually the Alphabet Carbon Manager automatically understands what methodology needs to be applied. So the fleet managers don't really need to think about this. And again, all our calculation methods are actually aligned with the most reliable standards, which is the GHG protocol, and are also TÜV certified, which particularly in the context of the CSRD is something that I wanted to stress, because that really helps auditors to ensure that the data that the tool provides is valid. That's it from my part. I'll hand it back to Andreas.
Thank you, Hannes. Very interesting. Of course, emission factors, carbon accounting, it's new for all of us, for most of you, also for us. But that's why we have our partner with us, right, to explain us and to guide us through. And also that's the reason why we decided to develop the Alphabet Carbon Manager together with a partner, together with the carbon accounting specialists. And I think it's now time to have a look into the tool and to give you a short demo on what the Alphabet Carbon Manager is actually all about. So I opened the Alphabet Carbon Manager already. You can see it's a browser-based software where which you can basically open for everywhere you are. So nothing has to be installed and so on and so forth. And what you can see on this screen is the dashboard. It's the heart of the Alphabet Carbon Manager, which shows you the numbers which you need to manage your fleet in terms of CO2 emissions in the right way. Let me guide you through this a little bit. You can see already in the first section that you can see from this example fleet the share of different engine types which are currently included in this fleet. So we have a share of 28 plug-in hybrids, 6.5% is of battery electric vehicle, 10% of petrol vehicles, and which is pretty normal for fleets, still a very high amount of or diesel share within the fleet. Overall, right now we are looking to a fleet with 138 cars, and on the right side we can see the total emissions these 138 cars have emitted in the past years. So you can also see that I've now set the time base from January 2018 to October 2023, so basically till now. But normally if you do carbon accounting, you want to look at the last year, also if you have to do a report. And then you can simply say, okay, I'm interested at the carbon emissions from last year, and then the tool calculates every number new. You can then also see what the share was in the last year. You can see the number of vehicles, and you can see the total emissions again calculated for the past year, so 2022. So this example fleet emitted 469 tons of CO2. Straight to the left, you can see the WLTP emissions from this fleet. WLTP, that's a number most of us are familiar with, because it's the number every OEM has to give us when introducing a car. It's the emission factor from in a very accurate test driver behavior. And what is pretty normal that the total emissions are higher than this. What you can also see, and we've talked about this in the presentation earlier, is the cost of carbon from the past year if this kind of company would like to compensate the CO2 emissions. We have also other numbers included right now, an average benchmark of an example fleet compared to the fleet which we are now analyzing, and also the WLTP emissions per kilometer driven for the vehicle, and also an average on this.
Actually, if I may, real quick, that's actually a super interesting number, the average fleet benchmark per kilometer driven, the 0.31, because this really helps fleet managers understand, like, well, on a kilometer basis, how actually do my emissions look like? And you can actually also zoom in into individual vehicles and actually get the same number, so you actually understand how are actually your cars within your fleet performing in terms of their emissions efficiency, which I think is a very important number, because if we see like the total number, for example, 3,200 tons, that's an important number. That's an important number to report. But for you to really understand how is your fleet performing according to maybe driver or maybe according to the car, it's really great if you can break this down really to the per kilometer basis, be that as a fleet average or for the individual car.
Break this down, that's a good topic. If we scroll down in the Alphabet Car Manager, you can see the fleet emission over time. You can of course say, okay, I want to have it on the monthly base, on the yearly base, or quarterly base. But you can also say you want to break this down really on the make, on the vehicle type, for example, and then it's calculated automatically the emissions divided to the different brands you have in your fleet. So you can also compare different brands to each other and see how they are behaving. But always don't forget the driver who is in the car is most likely responsible for the emissions, and you can drive every car with a much higher amount of CO2 emission than it is built for. So this is the overview section basically, where you can also see the count of vehicles, then the share, of course, the share of emissions per fuel type, and so on and so forth. But how do the data actually get into the tool, right? And therefore we have another section, collect and update data. So for the Alphabet fleet you have with us, the data will be automatically uploaded from us and Plan A and calculated. But we also understood that you have maybe also other partners where you're leasing your cars, and you want to get the whole picture, right? So therefore we made it possible that you can update and upload the data also from other lease codes. If you click here and then upload new data, you will find a section where you have the possibility to say, okay, I want to upload data for also leased cars not within Alphabet. And here, as Johannes mentioned, you have different opportunities, you have different possibilities to upload the data. Either you have the actual fuel consumption, so you have a fuel card within this car, or you maybe don't only have the average consumption or even the distance. So basically, we do not need 100% data accuracy to make the calculation also within the Greenhouse Gas Protocol directive. Is that right, Johannes?
Exactly. That's really the strength of this tool that, as I mentioned earlier in my example, you might always encounter difficulties actually having complete data, particularly if you're operating a really large fleet. There might be maybe some gaps from year to year, or maybe some gaps between drivers. Maybe somebody didn't submit the information of its fuel card. So you sometimes have simply to deal with incomplete data, and really the powerful options that the Alphabet Car Manager provides is that it accounts for all these different possibilities. So again, you don't need to worry about like applying different methodologies. The only thing you need to do is upload your data, click enter, and that's done. And I think that is really something that really makes it easy to, as I said earlier, have subject matter expertise in a software and not need subject matter expertise in your offices.
And it's most likely with all of the software, if you use it for the first time, you will need to get used to it. You will also figure out how to upload the right data. But as you're doing it over the years and over the months, you will, of course, become better and faster and easier. And we as Alphabet, of course, also support you in this beginning phase when we are introduce you to the new tool. But let us look into the other sections. What we also have in the Alphabet Carbon Manager is the export data, the export section. And this is, of course, we mentioned this earlier, Fleet is not the only CO2 emitter. For a full report for a company, Fleet is a part of it. So if you have another tool where you are calculating your CO2 emissions, you can also download the data, calculate it within the Alphabet Carbon Manager, and integrate this in your additional carbon accounting system. And then we also have frequently, sorry for that, we have frequently the demand from our management or for the sustainability departments to give us an easy to understand, easy readable report. And we also thought about this, and that's why we include this section, Fleet Emission Analysis as PDF. And here you have the possibility to create a report, very easy to read because it's PDF based, it's not a lot of numbers, where you can easily show the numbers the management and the sustainability departments ask you for the demanded time frame. The last section I wanted to show you is the reduction scenarios. So we talked about calculating CO2 emissions, but it's also about reducing CO2 emissions and doing prognosis for the future. So how will my fleet look in the future? And for this, we have the section reduction scenarios. Right now, we have two reduction scenarios included. First of all is replace all non-BEV vehicles with BEV vehicles as the lease expires. So the tool calculates automatically when a lease contract is going to an end, what would be the emission if this would be replaced via a battery electric vehicle. And why are we not going into zero here? That is due to the fact that the Alphabet Carbon Manager calculates with gray energy mix. And as we just learned from the presentation of Johannes, gray energy is also emitting CO2. But you also have the possibility, if you know that you are only using green electricity at the facilities, if all your drivers which have a battery electric vehicle have a green electricity contract at home and you're using a green public charging card to set this into the tool, that this is calculated then with zero emissions. But as a standard, we say that normally we cannot know, for example, how the electricity is at your facility, and therefore the tool calculates automatically with gray electricity. But not only the EU electricity mix, it's done via national energy mixes. Exactly. So for example, in France, as far as I know, the green electricity share is much higher than in Germany, for example.
That is true, and also what's very high in France, for example, is the share of nuclear energy. So as we know, nuclear energy, of course, also in the life cycle of nuclear power plants, there are emissions involved, but in France, due to a high share of nuclear energy, the emissions from the electricity are lower. Maybe one detail to mention, when you upload the data in the tool, you indicate by simply using an ISO code in which country your fleet is located. So for example, DE for Germany, ET for Italy, and so on and so on. And what that does actually, it signals the Carbon Manager to apply the respective conversion factors. Remember, I mentioned that earlier in my presentation, and also apply the respective grid mix that Andreas was just explaining to you. So for example, in this in the example here, I think we use the EU average, but if you would upload a fleet that was operating, let's say, 50 vehicles in France, 30 vehicles in Italy, and 20 vehicles in Germany, it would automatically apply the corresponding conversion factors of those countries that correspond with each individual car.
Very cool feature, I believe. But replacing combustion engine vehicles with battery electric vehicles is not the only way to reduce your CO2 emissions. Of course, you also have combustion engine cars, and you will have them also for the next years, most likely, because you cannot replace them 100% with battery electric vehicles. So therefore, we included several additional reduction measures, which you can see here. And these reduction measures, they are calculating automatically the potential of CO2 reduction for your individual fleet. So remember, right now we are looking in the fleet with 137 cars, and now we have the topic of an eco-driver training. Everyone has heard about eco-driver training, and everyone knows also that this can be saving fuel, and with this saving CO2 emissions. So what the tool does is it automatically calculates for your individual tool for this certain time frame the reduction potential. Johannes, maybe you can give us 1 or 2 words how you are calculating this kind of reduction potential.
Exactly. So you see in the example that there are several what we call emissions mitigation actions that you can choose that help you to reduce your emissions in your fleet that go beyond just, not just, but switching from a combustion engine to a battery electric vehicles. And so you can actually select all or just some of these actions that give you a mitigation potential that was calculated at Plan A. So just for context, like my team actually at Plan A consists of environmental engineers and environmental scientists that did a lot of research, understanding what is the latest research on these potential mitigation actions. And then we simply applied an average value of this research, as well as compared this to where available real-world test data to apply these, let's say, ranges of mitigation potential. So when you click on or select some of these actions, it helps you understand how can you reduce your emissions beyond what we were covering earlier and what Andreas illustrated on the tool, shifting away from combustion engines to battery electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles.
Thank you, Johannes. So to sum it up, what is the Alphabet Carbon Manager capable of? It calculates your CO2 emissions of your fleet in a way which is reliable and which is also in line with the standard of the greenhouse gas protocol, for example. It gives you the opportunity to also upload other vehicles from other lease codes, so that you have the full picture of the CO2 emissions of your full fleet. And of course, it gives you the possibility to monitor your development of the CO2 emissions of your fleet for the next years, and also makes it easy to do prognosis on how the CO2 emissions will be proceed in the next years. Especially if you're thinking about transforming your fleet to a battery electric vehicle, I think it makes sense to have a knowledge on what is actually the reduction potential, because maybe that's also not enough, right? Maybe if you're not using green electricity, you will not reach the set CO2 decarbonization targets which comes from your headquarter, and therefore you have to find other solutions to also decarbonize your fleet. Also, the tool enriches the data which you have. So if you don't have for all your vehicles the real consumption or the real electricity which is used, this is done also automatically within the tool, and it gives you basically a very good overview on the current CO2 emissions within your fleet. So we are coming to an end of this webcast, and I would like to ask you if you have further questions which we can ask or can answer, and we can make advantage of the expert with me today in the studio. So if you have further questions in terms of carbon accounting or in terms of CO2 emissions for fleet, please write it in the chat in your screen, and we are going to answer it. One of the first questions I would have, Johannes, would be individual reduction measures and the possibility to integrate new individual reduction measures. So right now we saw that we have integrated the transforming to battery electric vehicle or plug-in hybrid vehicles and a couple of other reduction measures. But I would assume that you and your team are working also on additional reduction measures. And the question would be, what if there would be a customer having a question towards an individual reduction measures and the potential? Would you also be capable of calculating this individual only for one client?
Good question, but sure, certainly we can answer these individual questions. We do have actually services that help individual clients to answer very specific questions. So as you may know, we work not only with fleet managers and with Alphabet, we really work with a wide variety of organization companies from all sorts of different sectors. And these type of individual company questions come up quite frequently, right? Because some of the measures they already have planned and they don't know how to quantify the mitigation potential of them. It can be very client specific, can be very industry specific, or maybe clients don't really know what they can do beyond what they've already applied. So we do provide services to individual companies to really do deep dive into emissions and help them understand not only their emissions, but also provide them additional services, additional consulting that goes beyond what we provide in our tool to really help them understand how can they decarbonize and what is really precisely the mitigation potential of those actions.
Thank you, Johannes. That's also a question I just got. Basically, as we stated, with Alphabet Carbon Manager, we are only looking for the CO2 emissions within the fleet. Right. But you as Plan A, you are capable also of doing the carbon accounting for the whole company, for the whole organization. And would it also be possible to use the data from the Alphabet Carbon Manager to include it in a bigger a calculation for the whole organization, for example, within your services?
Sure, exactly. So really carbon accounting at large is really our bread and butter, which means we provide services, as I said, to companies of all sorts of industries, and we are not just specialized on fleet emissions or let's say emissions that come from vehicles, but we really cover all the scopes. I don't know if you remember from the presentation, I gave you this overview of all the different scopes of emissions as well as scope 3 upstream and downstream emissions. And so what our tool does, it really can calculate all sorts of emissions, all categories of emissions. And so we would be able to, on the one hand, support Alphabet clients, not only provide them the entire corporate carbon footprint, which includes all these scopes, but also, for example, take this information from the Alphabet Carbon Manager and integrate it in their corporate carbon footprint.
Yeah. I have another question I think you can answer. The question is, what about countries that do not use fuel cards? How can we measure the fuel consumptions or CO2 emissions? I think you stated it earlier before that the tool is capable of calculating the CO2 emissions also if we don't have the exact fuel consumption or the exact mileages, right?
Exactly. So as you pointed out earlier, of course, the better the data, the more precise are the calculations. And if you have fuel consumption that makes the data very precise. But as pointed out in my presentation, we apply the various methodologies of the greenhouse gas protocol that can actually account for the fact that, as this example pointed out, in some countries, maybe your fleets don't use fuel cards and maybe the data on fuel consumption is not always provided. So there are different fallbacks, I'm just gonna mention one, if you have, for example, the total mileage that the cars have been driven over a time frame, we can actually estimate I'm not going to go into the technical details of the methodologies, but we can actually estimate the average fuel consumption that this car with that specific make and model would use over the be that quarterly, be that half yearly or yearly time frame, and then based on the total mileage, estimate the emissions just with that data. And as you pointed out, the Carbon Manager actually accounts for all these different methodologies. So in the case where those fuel card readings aren't available, we would use the second best option to estimate emissions.
Thank you, Johannes, for this answer, and thank you for being with me today in the studio. To all the questions which we could not answer right now, we will try to get the right contact persons and answer you afterwards via email. If not, please also feel free to reach out to us, to me, or to your contact person within your country. And with this, to stick to the time, I will send out the key takeaways via email to all participants. I just want to say thank you for being with us this morning. The Alphabet Carbon Manager is now available. Please contact your contact persons in your markets to get a more deeper demo version and to talk about the next steps. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you.